Have you ever looked at a government and thought, man, this is complicated? Well, the Philippine government, it's on another level. It's a system where you have a president with massive power, but also the smallest political unit in the world, the Barangay, which acts like a tiny independent republic. But here's the hook. This isn't just a boring civics lesson. The entire structure of the Philippine government isn't based on a constitution or a law or a king. It is based on a boat. What if I told you that the modern mayor is just a rebranded boat captain, and that the reason Filipino politics is so family-oriented isn't just culture, it's because the original political unit was literally a family floating on the ocean? And here is the dopamine kicker. The Philippines established the first democratic republic in Asia, but it was sold to the United States for $20 million before it even had a chance to start. And we need to talk about the Mickey Mouse money that destroyed an economy and the Rolex 12 who helped a dictator seize power. This is the story of how a boat became a nation. To understand the Philippine government, you have to delete the map. Forget the borders. Forget the Philippines. Rewind 1,000 years. There is no country. There are no provinces. There are just bottom guys. Now, you hear that word today and you think neighborhood, right? It's the smallest unit of local government. But the origin of that word is the key to everything. Barangay comes from Balangay. A balangay was a massive wooden plank-edged boat. These were the vessels that the Austronesian ancestors used to cross the ocean, and when they landed, they didn't just split up. The people on the boat stayed together. The boat became the village. The captain of the boat became the Datu, the chief. The rowers and warriors became the marhalika, or nobles, and the timawa, or free men. And the people who didn't have status? They became the alipin, or dependents. This is your first big aha moment. The original political structure wasn't based on land territory, it was based on the social structure of a ship. The Datu wasn't an absolute king who ruled by divine right over a specific piece of dirt. He was a captain. You followed him because he knew how to navigate. He knew how to keep the ship afloat. If he was a bad captain, you could just move to another boat. You could shift your allegiance. This created a system of government based on kinship, loyalty, and mutual survival. It wasn't about lines on a map. It was about who you were with. These barangays were independent city-states. Some were small, just 30 to 100 families, but others, like Maynila, Tondo, or Butuan, were massive, complex Rajanate and Sultanates, with trade networks reaching China and India. So you had this archipelago of thousands of independent boat states, trading, fighting, and marrying each other. It was a decentralized web of power. But there is a myth we need to bust right here. Have you ever heard of the Code of Kalantiao? For decades, history books taught that this was an ancient pre-colonial legal code from 1433 written by Datu Kalantiao. It had laws like don't kill sharks and brutal punishments. Here is the twist. It is a hoax. It was completely made up in 1913 by a man named Jose Marco. There was no Code of Kalantiao. The real pre-colonial laws were oral traditions decided by the Datu and a council of elders. So we have a system of independent captains, but what happens when a foreign empire shows up and tries to put all those captains in a box? That leads us to the hack. The Spanish arrive in the 16th century, And they look at this web of independent Datus and say, no, this is too messy. We need one king. We need one god. And we need you all to pay taxes. But how do you control 1,000 independent boat captains scattered across 7,000 islands? You don't just conquer them, you have to hack their system. We are about to see the greatest political magic trick in history. The Spanish didn't kill the Datus, they hired them. If you want to know how your local mayor got so powerful, you need to see this. So, the Spanish want control, but there are only a few hundred Spaniards and millions of locals. They used a strategy called reduction. Basically, the Filipinos were living all over the place, near their farms, in the forests, along the rivers. The Spanish friars said everyone must live bajo de la campana, under the bells. They forced people to move from their scattered farms into centralized towns or pueblos centered around a church and a municipal hall. This is the origin of the plaza complex you see in every Filipino town today. It wasn't just urban planning, it was surveillance. But what about the Datus? The captains? Here is the genius and evil part. The Spanish went to the Datus and said, "Hey, you used to be a chief? Good news, you're still a chief. But now we call you Cabeza de Barangay, head of the barangay. You get to keep your status, you get to keep your land. You don't have to pay taxes, but you have to collect taxes from everyone else for us." Boom. In one move, the Spanish turned the indigenous leaders into colonial tax collectors. They created the Principalía class. This is the origin of the Filipino political dynasties. The families who were Datus became cabezas, who later became mayors, who later became governors. The power stayed in the same families for 500 years. And this is where another famous Filipino concept comes from, the Padrino System. Padrino means godfather. In the Spanish Catholic system, you have godparents for baptism. The Principalía used this to cement alliances. You make the governor the godfather of your child. Now you're compadres, your family. This twisted the ancient value of utang na loob, or reciprocity, into a tool for political patronage. I gave you a job, now you owe me your vote. The boat captain became the political boss. But the structure changed. It went from a web of independent boats to a strict pyramid. At the top, the Governor General. He was the representative of the King of Spain. He had absolute power. He was the executive, the legislative, and the judicial all rolled into one. He was essentially a king in Manila. For 333 years, this was the system. Centralized power in Manila, local power held by elite families. But eventually, the pressure cooker exploded. Fast forward to 1898, the Revolution. And here's a massive dopamine breadcrumb that gets left out of history books. The Philippines created the first republic in Asia. In 1899, in Malolos, Bulacan, the revolutionaries wrote a constitution. The Malolos Constitution, and it was advanced. It was democratic. It had a separation of powers. It established a legislature. It was way ahead of its time for the region. They proved they could govern themselves. They had a president, Emilio Aguinaldo, a Congress, and a cabinet. They were a sovereign nation. But they never got the chance to really govern. Why? Because of a receipt. While the Philippines were declaring independence and writing constitutions, Spain was secretly selling them to the United States. The price tag was $20 million. The U.S. paid Spain $20 million in the Treaty of Paris to take over the Philippines. The First Republic was ignored. It was crushed in the Philippine-American War. And the Americans? They brought a whole new system. Public schools, elections, and the English language. They called it benevolent assimilation. But here's the catch. At first, who could vote? only men who owned property or could speak English or Spanish. Basically, the Principalía, the same elite families. So the Americans layered democracy on top of the Spanish oligarchy, which was layered on top of the indigenous chieftainship. They created the Commonwealth in 1935. This was the training wheels government. Manuel L. Quezon became the first president of the Commonwealth. It was a presidential system modeled directly after the U.S. It looked American, it sounded American, but underneath, the Filipino leaders weren't entirely sold on the American dream. In fact, President Manuel L. Quezon dropped one of the hardest, most savage quotes in political history. He said, "I would rather have a government run like hell by Filipinos than a government run like heaven by Americans." That is a mic drop. It captures the entire spirit of the era. They wanted independence, even if it was messy. And messy it was, because just a few years later, the government stopped being run by Filipinos or Americans. World War II, the Japanese invade. This creates the darkest political paradox. The Japanese set up the Second Republic. It was a puppet government, led by President Jose P. Laurel. Laurel is one of the most controversial figures in history. Was he a collaborator, or was he a hero who took the job to shield his people from the Japanese military? It's a question that still divides historians. But during this time, the economy collapsed. The Japanese printed new money. It looked like pesos, but it had no value. The Filipinos called it Mickey Mouse money. Why? Because it was like play money. It was worthless. You needed a bayong, a woven bag full of bills just to buy a box of matches. It taught the Filipinos a hard lesson. Government structures can be fake. Real power is what matters. Finally, 1946. The war ends. True independence. The Third Republic. But the boat was rocking. Corruption, rebellion, poverty. And then 1972. Ferdinand Marcos declares martial law. He tears up the Constitution. He centralizes power again, just like the Spanish governor generals. He rules by decree. And here is another myth, the Rolex 12. Legend has it that Marcos planned martial law with a secret group of 12 military and defense advisors, and as a reward, he gave them all solid gold Rolex watches. Is it true? Well, they did exist. They were his inner circle, the architects of the regime. Whether they all got the actual watches is debated. Some say they were Omegas, but the name Rolex 12 stuck as a symbol of the luxury and power they enjoyed while the country suffered. Marcos stayed in power for 20 years. It looked like the era of the Datu was gone forever, replaced by a single absolute king. But then, 1986, people power. Millions of Filipinos pour into the streets of Idas. They stop tanks with flowers and rosaries. They oust the dictator without firing a shot. It was the ultimate Bayanhan moment, the community coming together to move the house of the state. They wrote a new constitution in 1987, the one used today. It restored democracy. It put in huge safeguards against martial law. But here is the final climax, the lesson. Despite all these changes, from datus to kings to presidents to dictators, the heart of the government is still the barangay. The barangay is unique in the world. It's not just a neighborhood association, it is a government unit. It has a captain, barangay captain. It has a council, kagawad. It has its own justice system, etarungan barangay. In the barangay, you don't go to court for small fights, you go to the captain. He mediates, just like the Datu did 1,000 years ago. The Philippine government is a palimpsest. It's manuscript written over and over again. It has the form of an American democracy. It has the religion and centralization of the Spanish colony. But at its core, down in the neighborhoods, it is still a fleet of balangays. It is still a system based on captains, kinship, and keeping the boat afloat together. And that spirit, that unique mix of indigenous style and foreign adaptation, is exactly what we see in the clothing, the music, and the dance. What happens when you take a Spanish dress and make it out of pineapple fiber? Or take a bamboo trap and turn it into a dance? That is part 9, the origin of traditional clothing, music, and dance. And that is the origin of the government. From boat captains to a $20 million receipt. What was the biggest surprise for you? Was it that Barangay literally means boat? Or that the Philippines established the first republic in Asia? Or that savage Manuel El Cazan quote about government run like hell? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This was part 8. We are almost at the end. Please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss part 9. We're going to look at the Barong Tagalog and the Tinikling. It's going to be colorful. Thanks for watching.